We are kicking things off. I'm Joe.
And hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be right now. I'm Sunny, and welcome back to Sip&Talk.
Welcome back, Sip&Talkers. So, I was at this coffee shop in Silicon Valley the other day, right? And I was just listening to the orders in front of me.
Oh boy. Let me guess, it was a paragraph long.
Literally a paragraph. It is never just coffee anymore. This guy orders an iced oat milk latte, 30% sugar, light ice, and made a huge point of saying absolutely no plastic straw.
Yeah, I mean, it has basically become a whole identity statement in a cup, you know? You are projecting your values, your diet, your entire lifestyle all before 9 in the morning.
Exactly. I mean, we rely so heavily on those little labels to define who we are. But imagine this scenario.
Okay, lay it on me.
You walk into your regular spot in New York or the Bay Area. You order your highly specific oat milk latte. And the barista just looks you dead in the eye and says, "I am sorry, but oat milk does not exist."
Wait, like they ran out?
No. Like, they tell you it conceptually does not exist in the world. You are drinking black coffee. And by the way, you are no longer allowed to use your own name. From now on, you are only allowed to refer to yourself as beverage consumer number 4.
I would honestly assume I had stumbled into some bizarre psychological experiment. Or maybe just a really pretentious performance art piece about losing your free will. You would just feel completely erased.
Right. You'd think it was a bad joke. But what if a massive geopolitical superpower decided to run that exact same experiment on an entire democratic government?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a heavy pivot.
It is happening. What if they systematically decided to delete a political entity's identity, telling the world that its name, its elected officials, and its very existence are entirely fabricated?
And that is exactly what we are getting into today on Sip&Talk. We are unpacking a highly complex strategy, essentially legal warfare and a cognitive campaign being waged right now by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and the goal here is to systematically erase the Republic of China and fundamentally redefine what the concept of Taiwan independence actually means.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of how you delete a country's identity, we should probably set some ground rules for today's conversation.
Definitely. I want to be super clear with you all listening. The goal today is entirely analytical. We are not here to take political sides, and we are not endorsing any specific viewpoint.
Right. If you look at current international affairs, there is a very heavy emphasis on practicality and clear-eyed realism. It is very much like the approach you see from figures like Trump, who tend to prioritize raw geopolitical realities over polite diplomatic sentiment.
Yeah, just looking at what is actually happening on the board.
Exactly. We are applying that same objective clarity today. We want to deconstruct the logical frameworks, the geopolitical maneuvers, and the massive paradoxes we're seeing in recent intelligence reports, demographic data from Pew Research, and analysis from places like The Economist and the NYT.
So let's move from the abstract idea of a coffee shop identity crisis to concrete, real-world actions happening right now in April 2026. Let's talk about this zeroing project.
The zeroing project, yeah.
How does a superpower actually execute the deletion of a neighboring government?
Well, it begins with establishing an uncompromising premise that completely reshapes international law. For Beijing, the one China principle is not an opening position for a negotiation.
Right, it is not a bargaining chip.
No, not at all. It is presented as an absolute non-negotiable fact. The premise dictates that the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government, Taiwan is merely a province, and sovereignty cannot be divided or shared under any circumstances whatsoever.
Okay, so let's look at how that premise physically manifests in the real world. Because we saw this recently with President Lai Ching-te's planned visit to Eswatini.
Yeah, that was a huge incident.
And this was not just a standard diplomatic cold shoulder.
Right.
While coordinating the flight path, countries like Seychelles, Mauritius, and Madagascar abruptly revoked the presidential flight's overflight permissions.
Completely pulled the plug.
What are the actual mechanics of that? I mean, are they scrambling jets to turn a plane around midair?
No, it operates primarily on the level of diplomatic and legal coercion. You know, for a head of state to fly over another country's sovereign airspace, you need pre-approved diplomatic clearance.
All right. It is basically an international permit.
Exactly. So by leaning heavily on African nations that have really strong economic ties to Beijing, the PRC essentially forces those nations to deny or pull that clearance.
Oh.
The mechanical effect is that the presidential plane literally cannot plot a legal flight path. It sends a chilling message to the world. Taiwan has no diplomatic aviation rights, and its leaders do not possess the privileges of statehood.
And the rhetoric accompanying this blockade is what really caught my attention. The foreign ministry didn't just express, mild disapproval of the trip.
Oh, no, they went much further.
They explicitly stated, and I'm quoting here, there has long been no such thing as a president of the Republic of China. They actually labeled international diplomatic visits as swindling.
Swindling. The phrasing there is highly, highly deliberate. By using the word swindling, they are essentially criminalizing the act of diplomacy itself.
It is like they're calling them con artists.
That is exactly the point. They are telling the international community that entertaining a visit from Taiwan's leadership is basically participating in a fraud. And it extends beyond just flights. It is a systematic erasure of the Republic of China flag and symbols globally.
Yeah, we are seeing pressure applied at international sporting events, right?
Mm-hmm. And in sovereign nations like the Philippines and Malaysia, they are being pressured to physically cover up or remove any visual representation of the ROC.
It reminds me of being in the tech scene. It is like a developer trying to patch a legacy character out of a video game's base code.
That is actually a great analogy.
Right. They're deleting the image files, they're scrubbing the text references, and they're blocking the character from moving around the map. But I really have to ask, can a government actually delete a political entity when 23 million people are still actively logging in and living that reality every single day?
And that right there is the massive friction point in this entire strategy. You literally cannot just overwrite the lived experience of millions of people with a diplomatic memo.
It just doesn't compute.
But Beijing's response to that friction is to move the goalposts so drastically that it shatters decades of established political frameworks. They are completely redefining the vocabulary of cross-strait relations.
So let's talk about that shifting vocabulary, specifically regarding the April 10th, 2026 meeting in Beijing between KMT chairman Cheng Li-wen and Xi Jinping.
Yeah, that meeting was huge.
It felt like the moment the diplomatic duct tape was finally just ripped off.
It was absolutely a watershed moment because it stripped away the disguise of the 1992 consensus. For decades, that consensus was the primary mechanism keeping cross-strait relations somewhat stable.
I have to admit, I have always been a little fuzzy on how the 1992 consensus actually functioned on the ground. People constantly throw around the phrase different interpretations, but what did that actually mean in practice?
Well, think of it as a brilliant, if somewhat fragile, piece of diplomatic fiction.
Okay, I'm tracking.
The basic idea is that both Taipei and Beijing agreed there is only one China. However, the different interpretations loophole allowed each side to basically go home and tell their people something entirely different.
Right.
Beijing could say one China means the PRC, and Taipei could say one China means the Republic of China. It allowed for trade and dialogue without either side having to officially surrender their core sovereignty.
It is the ultimate agree to disagree, but during this April 10th meeting, Beijing essentially took a sledgehammer to that loophole.
They did. They made it explicitly clear that the 1992 consensus only embodies the People's Republic of China. The era of different interpretations is officially dead.
Wow.
Beijing signaled that there is no longer any acceptable ambiguity.
Which brings us to the NYT analysis regarding how the label of Taiwan independence has been totally weaponized.
Yeah, this is a massive shift.
Because the traditional understanding of a separatist was someone actively pushing to draft a new constitution, right? Abandon the ROC framework entirely and create a brand new former Republic of Taiwan.
Exactly. But that definition has been vastly expanded now. Under this new framework, anyone who simply wants to maintain the current status quo of the Republic of China, or anyone who just refuses to accept Beijing as the sole central government, is now automatically labeled a separatist.
Wait, I need to push back on this logic for a second.
Go for it.
If the KMT's entire platform is literally about maintaining peace with the mainland and preserving the current democratic system under the ROC, how can Beijing possibly view them as separatists?
It sounds contradictory, doesn't it?
It totally does. Doesn't labeling everyone a separatist contradict Beijing's own United Front goals? It feels less like a real domestic movement they are fighting and more like a convenient external phantom they have just fabricated.
When you view it through the lens of internal cohesion, it actually makes perfect sense. Creating a massive, ever-present external threat is a classic mechanism for any authoritarian regime.
Especially when you look at China's 2026 domestic issues. I mean, you have soaring youth unemployment right now.
It is staggering.
And a real estate crisis that is just wiping out middle-class generational wealth. So pointing across the strait and warning the populace about dangerous separatists trying to divide the nation that serves as a massive distraction from the economic frustration at home.
It is an incredibly effective domestic distraction, but it creates a massive geopolitical paradox. And this is where the analysis from The Economist becomes really crucial to understand.
Okay, let's break that down.
By aggressively stripping away the Republic of China framework, Beijing is inadvertently creating the exact situation they want to avoid.
The law of unintended consequences strikes again. How does erasing the ROC actually hurt Beijing's territorial claims?
Because historically, the ROC framework served as a buffer. Even if Taipei and Beijing strongly disagreed on who was actually in charge, the ROC constitution maintained a nominal historical link to the concept of a greater China.
Right, there was still a shared historical vocabulary.
Exactly. But by aggressively deleting that framework and criminalizing the ROC itself, Beijing is pushing Taiwan into a corner where it looks more and more like a distinct sovereign entity that is just simply awaiting formal statehood.
I see.
From the perspective of international law, claiming jurisdiction over a completely separate, distinct entity is actually much harder than claiming jurisdiction over a rival faction in a suspended civil war.
Which perfectly explains their obsessive push to downgrade Taiwan to a rebel province. But, for the listener who isn't a UN historian, how does Beijing use that framing at the United Nations?
Oh, this is heavily tied to UN Resolution 2058.
Right, we keep seeing references to that. What exactly is that, and how does a document from the 1970s let Beijing block international intervention today?
So back in 1971, UN Resolution 2758 essentially recognized the PRC as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations. And that resulted in Taipei's representatives being expelled. Today, Beijing weaponizes that resolution. They argue that the UN already completely settled the Taiwan question decades ago.
So they use it as a shield.
Exactly. By framing Taiwan purely as a remnant of an internal civil war, they try to establish a legal wall. If a conflict breaks out, they can tell the U.S. and the UN, hey, this is an internal police action against a rebel province. It is not an international war, so you have absolutely no legal right to intervene.
Man, they are preemptively building a legal fortress.
Yeah.
But it's not just legal theory, right? It is actual physical strangulation.
Very physical.
The Institute for the Study of War published intelligence in April 2026 detailing suspected sabotage of Taiwan's submarine cables.
Yeah, that report was alarming.
They categorize it as non-war coercion. But how does cutting cables act as coercion if it is not technically an act of war?
It is classic gray zone warfare. Submarine cables carry almost all of the island's international internet and financial data.
Yeah, in the tech world, we know how completely reliant everything is on those fragile fiber optics.
Right. So if you strategically sever those cables, you cause massive economic chaos, you isolate the population digitally, and you disrupt military communications. But because it happens at the bottom of the ocean, you maintain plausible deniability.
So no one can definitively prove it was an attack.
Exactly. You achieve the isolating effects of a blockade without ever actually firing a missile that would trigger an international military response.
And then when you combine that digital isolation with debt diplomacy, the siege basically becomes global.
Yeah.
How exactly does Beijing use debt to change a country's foreign policy?
Mostly by targeting developing nations in Africa and Latin America with massive, massive infrastructure loans.
Money they know these countries can't pay back.
Right. When those nations inevitably struggle to service the debt, Beijing uses that financial leverage to extract political concessions, specifically forcing them to cut any remaining diplomatic or unofficial ties with Taiwan. It is just a slow, methodical strangulation of Taiwan's international presence.
But, here is where the psychological aspect completely backfires on Beijing.
Oh, the Pew data.
Yes. If you look at the recent demographic data from the Pew Research Center, you would assume this crushing external pressure would make the Taiwanese population just submit, give up.
You would think so.
But the data shows the exact opposite. As the pressure to erase the ROC mounts, identification with a pure Taiwanese identity is growing exponentially.
It is incredibly ironic. The Chinese Communist Party has inadvertently become the single strongest driver of Taiwan's independence consciousness.
It is like trying to put out a fire with a blanket made of gasoline. I mean, if you criminalize the act of holding up the Republic of China flag, aren't you essentially forcing those same people to put down that flag and hold up a sign that simply says Taiwan?
That is exactly what is happening. You are stripping away the middle ground and forcing the population into the exact identity you are supposedly trying to suppress.
Which brings us to the internal fallout for Taiwan itself. If Beijing is aggressively erasing that middle ground, how does a political party in Taiwan even function?
It creates a huge crisis.
Yeah, it is a political domino effect.
Yeah.
I want to look specifically at Taiwan's opposition party, the KMT. How do they campaign when the superpower next door weaponizes the very vocabulary they share?
Well, analysis from Foreign Affairs and the Brookings Institution highlights a fatal narrative split for the KMT right now.
How so?
Traditionally, their core platform relies on anti-independence rhetoric and promoting cross-strait dialogue. But because Beijing has now expanded the definition of independence to include the very existence of the Republic of China, which the KMT claims to defend, the KMT is totally trapped.
Oh, I see.
When they adopt Beijing's anti-independence talking points to show goodwill, they don't seem to realize they are unwittingly agreeing to their own erasure.
The consequences of that trap seem devastating on multiple fronts. What actually happens when a major domestic party gets caught in that kind of narrative split?
For Taiwan internally, it leads to political hollowing out. The KMT alienates middle voters who basically see the party as a passive participant in Beijing's cognitive encirclement.
They lose their own voice.
Exactly. The party loses the ability to define its own platform because Beijing is the one holding the dictionary. And externally, it signals deep division to the international community.
Right, because allies are watching this.
When allies like the U.S. and Japan see a major Taiwanese political party seemingly aligning with Beijing's rhetoric, it creates hesitation. It weakens international defense support because allies aren't sure if Taiwan is even united in its own defense.
Man, this feeds directly into a deep collective anxiety. Imagine you are holding a Taiwanese passport right now. For decades, the political mantra has just been maintain the status quo.
That was the safe harbor.
It was. But now they're realizing the safe harbor has been mined. The status quo is essentially dead because Beijing simply refuses to acknowledge its existence.
It forces a stark binary choice upon the population: dignity or submission. That diplomatic ambiguity that allowed for peace for so many years is just gone.
Let me put it in terms of a business negotiation, right?
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine co-signing a legally binding long-term contract with a massive corporation. You think you are agreeing to peace and stability, but hidden in the fine print is a clause stating the other party retains the exclusive right to redefine any word in the contract at any moment without your consent.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It is.
Yeah.
Because a year later, they unilaterally decide that their definition of peace means your complete and total surrender of all assets. You never agreed to that, but because you yielded the right to define the terms, you were trapped.
That is the ultimate cognitive trap being deployed here. You just cannot negotiate effectively when the other side controls the meaning of the words you're using.
I want to address you, the listener, for a second. Why should you care about a diplomatic strategy targeting an island thousands of miles away?
It is a great question.
Because this is fundamentally a story about the right to define reality, whether it is in global geopolitics, in your workplace, or in your personal life. Yielding the dictionary to someone else is a wildly dangerous game.
Absolutely.
If you allow an external force to define who you are, what your values are, and what your history is, you have already lost. The daily reality of 23 million people breathing, voting, innovating, and living their lives is the ultimate undeniable refutation of a fabricated political trap.
You cannot simply patch out reality.
No, you can't. And, stepping back from all this heavy political logic, I am reminded that even behind Beijing's massive narrative wall, not everyone is buying it.
Oh, for sure. We know a lot of folks from China here in the U.S. and the Bay Area and New York.
Right. And despite the intense censorship, if you look in the corners of the internet or within the Chinese diaspora, there are so many awake, clear-headed voices.
Totally. I actually had a friend from China tell me once that what they admire most about Taiwan isn't just the food or the culture, but the freedom of not living in fear of being defined by the state.
Wow, that is powerful.
Yeah, to them, a truly strong country shouldn't have to erase someone else's name just to prove its own strength.
And that is exactly what we need to remember. We often say here in the States, democracy is not a spectator sport. When Beijing tries to zero out the Republic of China, those clear-headed voices see it for what it is, a deep fear of free, independent spirits. The way the people on that island cling to their democracy, despite the insane pressure, it feels very, very universally human. It resonates with our American values of freedom, too.
Yeah, that stubbornness to stay free is something we can deeply relate to. It makes you feel a real kinship with them, because at the end of the day, it is about basic human dignity.
Exactly. So if you are out there fighting for your right to define yourself, just know you are not alone. Your allies aren't just politicians, but regular people all over the world who refuse to be gaslit by authoritarian rewriting of reality.
Which leaves us with a critical question to consider as we close today. If a massive authoritarian regime can successfully use economic weight, digital coercion, and legal warfare to essentially delete a democratic government's name from global existence, what does that mean for the entire future of international law?
It is a scary thought.
If reality can be completely rewritten simply by refusing to acknowledge it and by bullying the rest of the world into silence, whose reality will be deleted next?
That is a chilling thought to end on, but an important one. Stay curious, stay independent, everyone.
And hey, don't forget to subscribe to the Sip and Talk podcast so you never miss an episode.
Yes, please subscribe. And also, go check out our good buddy Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life.
Oh my gosh, yes.
He recently went to Taiwan for that massive religious event, the Baishatun Mazu pilgrimage. It is completely hilarious. You have to go see what kind of mess he got himself into this time.
Typical Mickey.
Totally.
Yeah.
He came back so happy with all his footage, and it turns out he wasn't even filming Mazu half the time.
Oh, that is too funny. Definitely go check out Mickey to Life on YouTube.
All right, Sip and Talkers, we will catch you on the next one.
Bye, everyone.